Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. All right, man, I appreciate everybody very much for stopping by. So we are on round 2 of the Champions Chess Tour final. And we have Maxime Vachier-Lagrave versus Wesley. And this is game 1 of that round. So it's a pretty interesting game. Has a lot of ideas and different concepts and stuff in it. So I think it was full of life. Of course, for all my people in the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking makaibigan. Hello, you lit. Magandang umaga, magandang hapon, magandang gabi, magandang araw. Appreciate you guys very much. Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking video. Aking makaibigan. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Anybody who is coming from France or who does speak French, I will say bonjour to you. Bon après-midi. Bon appetit déjeuner. Merci beaucoup, mes amis, for stopping by and taking a look at my stuff. Ça me fait plaisir de te voir, mes amis. Man, I got tongue-tied right there. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. It's nice to see you guys again, as always. If you guys are ready to go, checking, making sure we're good. Okay, let's roll it. Let's take a look and see what we got for this game. So we have knight to f3. So it starts off with the ready. Pretty much whenever you play knight to f3, it's the ready, but it's like always going to transpose into something else because you're going to be moving some pawns. So it's going to take the form of usually, not always, it'll usually take the form of a different opening. We do have d5, g3, knight comes to f6. We got bishop to g2, we got c6, and then we do have castles by white. And as you guys can see, we have transposed into the King's Indian attack. This is the Yugoslav variation. So bishop comes to g4. We see h3. You know, we're not worried about if the bishop takes, and then we got king up to either h2 or g2. You know, we're pretty safe in that structure. Bishop comes back to h5. We have c4. e6. Queen comes to b3. We do have queen to b6. And then we do have d3. We're not really too much worried about the queen taking. We will be taking with the pawn. And you know, we will have this open file. So in general, you don't necessarily want to have double pawns, but sometimes you can get some activity or nice control over certain areas, you know, when you do have a double pawn situation, especially in the center here. You know, you can, you know, control some pretty nice squares if you double your pawns up. So knight b comes to d7. We have queen down to c2, and then as early as move 9, we have the novelty of the game. So this is pawn takes c4. It has just never been seen before. It's interesting because this looks like a pretty normal position, but we are in brand new territory. Queen takes c4, and we got bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3. We do have knight to e5, which can kind of be annoying, but the fact that black just gave up their bishop for your bishop, it pretty much just evens out. I mean, there's not really anything major in either way. So you got queen coming over to f4, knight takes f3 with check, queen takes f3. We do see bishop to e7, knight comes to d2. You know, pretty clear intent that we're going to be popping this knight here on c4. It's a pretty good square for it. Also, it's going to be attacking the queen and stuff like that. So castles by black, knight comes to c4, and then we do have queen back to d8. And we have actually a very interesting move now, and it is b4. It might seem weird at first, like, why is he just throwing this pawn out here? Like, it's not protected. The bishop can take. Well, basically, what you're anticipating is that the bishop does take, you do have an open file, you know, for your rook to start, you know, becoming activated on. What we do see in the game is queen to d5, just offering a queen trade. You know, wanting to take back with probably the c-pawn, knocking this knight away somewhere. But if we did so happen to have bishop takes b4, of course, like I said, we'd have rook to b1. And then queen would most likely come to e7. You'd see d4, rook a to d8, and then rook to d1. And this queen is going to be swinging over, and you're going to be able to push a3. You can even push a3 now. But, you know, you have definitely some activity for giving up the pawn. So you do have some attacks that you can possibly roll. But like I said, queen came to d5, and so you have a decision to make as white. Do you want to go into a trade, or do you want to try to keep queens on? So Maxime says, I want to keep queens on, so he goes e4. Queen goes back to d8. We see rook over to b1, just protecting the pawn now. We got rook over to c8. Bishop comes to d2. So, I mean, it's like almost dead even. It's maybe just, you know, an inch better for black. But, you know, white has done everything they needed to do. You know, they've gotten their rooks connected. All of their pieces are out. You know, they have pretty good central control. They have their good king safety. So, I mean, you know, and I mean, black has pretty much done the same thing. I mean, the queen has come out and went back. So, you know, both players are pretty much done what they needed to do by this point. So we do have b5. Trying to inconvenience the knight a little bit, but actually the knight is actually very comfortable over on a5. It is hitting a weak point because this pawn is advanced. It is kind of stopping these two pawns here. So it's a little bit tough to you know, push the pawn. So we're doing good. So queen comes to d7. We see rook f to d1. We got e5, just trying to prevent, you know, kind of do the same thing that white's doing over here on this side, just trying to prevent, you know, these pawns from moving. And so as you can see, you know, it's a little difficult to push d4 in this situation. Now, we do see king to g2, rook f to d8. We got bishop over to c3. I mean, let's tickle this pawn. Like, why not? We do have queen over to e6, trying to throw a little bit of attack on this pawn over here. Knight comes back to b3. We see h6. Queen comes over to e3, and I mean, as you can see, you know, white is eyeing this square very, very heavily. It's also trying to place a little bit of an attack on this pawn over here. So, you know, black definitely has some things to deal with. Rook comes to d7. We do see rook up to d2. Knight comes back to h7, and then we do see h4. You know, just making sure that we take as many squares away from the knight as possible. And that's definitely something that you want to do in your games. You know, when you're playing, you know, you want to try to think like, you know, where does my opponent want to place his pieces? Of course, I mean, don't drop tactics in the process of that, but, you know, where does my opponent want to try to put his pieces? Usually you can tell where your opponent wants to try to put a piece based on the previous move that they made. So knight coming back to h7 is either pretty much telling you two things. Either this knight is trying to redirect, or you know, maybe even come back and do something like that, or you are trying to push f5, which f5 is a logical you know, thought. So knight does come back to f6. Rook b comes to d1. We got a5, and then the knight plops down onto c5. And you know, this can actually be a little bit annoying. You're very much encouraging a trade of this bishop because this knight is attacking the queen and the rook, you know, in a little fork situation. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video right here, there is actually a really nice move that black has at their disposal. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can find this move. Okay, cool. So, you know, whenever you are being attacked, like I said before, it is kind of hard to like separate yourself from that situation and kind of back up and think like, okay, you know, what else can I do in this position, right? Because I mean, immediately you're thinking, oh man, I'm forked. Like my queen, especially my queen is hit right here. So that's automatically going to be one of the first things, you know, you're going to be thinking about. But these players right here that are on this level, they are very good at kind of separating you know, the way that they feel about a certain move that was made and trying to actively think of an alternate type of move that they can place. It wasn't caught in this game. What was actually played in the game was bishop takes c5. But the really, really nice move, just to try to kind of like give a counterattack and knock white off of their kilter a little bit, is actually knight down to g4. You know, you're going to go into, you know, some possible trades here. I mean, you have the opportunity to take here and then to take here. And then, of course, this has to be recaptured like this. You know, one of the best moves that white can actually make is just to retreat their own queen, not accept, you know, the damaging of structure and stuff like that. And then now, one of the major things that knight to g4 did is initially, you know, this queen was protecting this knight. So, you know, once the bishop would take, the queen would take, which is what we actually saw in the game, you know, it would be a better capture than to try to take back with the pawn because you are kind of giving black a little bit of opportunity to gain some temples on you, which I believe, see in the game as well. But after the queen comes down to e2, you see that now that is not possible. So after the bishop takes on c5, you have to take back with the pawn. And then b4, like I said, does inconvenience the bishop. And now the bishop does have to retreat. Of course, this is a little bit of a trap because the queen taking here would be bad after the bishop takes on e5. So we don't want to get into that. But as you can see, you know, this pawn is just a little bit lonely. This bishop is not in the best spot. You know, black has definitely a much more forceful position here. So that was actually a really nice possibility that was in the game. But we did see knight to c5, and then we just saw the immediate bishop takes c5. Queen takes c5. We see pawn takes b4. And then you have a decision to make. I mean, you can take with the queen, you can take with the bishop, and you can also take this pawn. You know, one of the things that you think about as far as like pawns in general is usually central pawns are worth just a little bit more than wing pawns. So yes, you do have the ability to take this pawn, but you also have the ability to take this pawn as well. And so that's what Maxime Vachier-Lagrave does. He goes ahead and takes that pawn on e5. You know, it's not always the case, but you know, this does allow your pawns to move a little bit more freely. So it does have a little bit more value with that e5 pawn. So we do see knight down to g4. Bishop comes back to b2. The same type of tactic is present in the position because if the queen takes, the bishop takes on g7. You know, you are hitting some sensitive points and just discouraging an attack on the queen. The rook comes over to a8 in light of that situation. You do see f3 inconveniencing this knight. The knight comes back to f6. We got rook over to c1 because if you're going to attack me, I'm going to attack you. So rook does come to a6 protecting. We see rook c to c2. And now it would actually be somewhat dangerous for you to take here, especially with the queen, because you do have a discover attack with bishop takes f6. We do see b3, pawn takes b3, queen takes b3. We have queen over to b5. You know, it is a tit for tat, you know, as far as like trading pawns is concerned. But I mean, these pawns over here are actually a little bit more important because they do surround the king. So you definitely have the ability to, you know, start kind of opening the king's position if you go into these trades over here, you know, with the rook taking and rook taking stuff like this. So the queen comes back to e6 we do see g4. Queen comes up to e7. We do see bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, and we do have d4. And we actually have a really nice trade offer by Wesley So here. It's just queen to e6. I talk to you guys all the time about trying to improve your position, trying to improve your pieces, trying to do things that are good for you. And one of the things that you probably should notice in a position is these doubled pawns for black. And is there a way that I maybe can try to improve those pawns to try to undouble them? And so queen coming to e6 is recognizing that your pawn chain, you know, your pawn structure is bad. So what better way to do that than to, you know, want to maybe have a white trade here, and then now you have a much better pawn structure. But of course, Maxime is not going to do that because then you would be helping your opponent. So we do see queen retreating back to f4. King comes up to g7. We see rook up to c5, which is a really beautiful rook lift because we are planning on, you know, shooting the rook over to attack this pawn over here. And so we do see rook down to a2. We got rook over to h5. Rook takes d2, queen takes d2, but as you can see, we are still trained on this square. So the king steps back to f8. We see rook takes h6, and we do see queen to c4. And, you know, what I can really say about the position is the fact that, you know, these, you know, damaging of this pawn structure over here definitely was very legitimate for white. You know, the structure is actually really nice for white, and they are up an entire pawn. So, I mean, you know, white is definitely in the driver's seat in this game. You know, black has a couple of tricks, but for the most part, you know, it's white's games to lose. So we do have d5, and then we have rook to a7, which is trying to be kind of tricky. As you guys can see, this rook actually can't come down onto the 7th rank, supported by the queen, and pin this this queen to the king. So we do sidestep that with king to g3. Pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5. So now, you know, you have a completely passed pawn for white. The queen comes up to c5. We see rook to h8 with check. King comes to e7. Queen comes down to e1 with check. King comes to d7. Queen comes to e8 with check. King goes to d6. We see queen to d8 with check. King comes down to e5. We see rook to h5 with check. King comes down to d4. And then we do see the absolute best possible move in the position, which is d6. And this is actually a very annoying move to try to meet by black. And it is actually in this position that Wesley So does resign the game. And it is just because you have so many problems with this particular move. You are trying to knock this queen away. Immediately, as you guys can see, I mean, if the queen can place itself on b6, there is a check and a fork situation going on right here between the rook and the king. So you absolutely really cannot move too many places. I mean, queen to c6 and queen to a3 are pretty much the only possible moves. If we did just take a look at one of those real quick, queen coming up to c6, you see queen taking f6 with check, king going down to d3, rook coming to e5, and what you're doing with the rook here is you are blocking this diagonal to the king to free the queen up to move. Queen coming to b6, rook coming to d5 with check, king coming to c4, and then rook coming down to d1, and you have given yourself what I call checking distance. So, you know, you are down 2 entire pawns, and this pawn is pretty unstoppable, and you just have way too many threats to your king. This pawn is going to be dropping at some point, so it's just not very nice looking. So nobody can blame Wesley son. So in this one, it is Malakas C. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. And I appreciate everybody very much for stopping by. Merci beaucoup, mes amis, to everybody that is coming from France. Makito Tayo Mamaya, and I will see you guys next time.